Okay, very good. Well, thank you very much for participating in our session Home Truth Towards Quality Affordable Housing. A very warm welcome to you all, and a very warm welcome also to our speakers. I would like to remind you that you can participate in our session through our application Wisembly and also through Twitter. So if you haven't already done so, I would like to invite you to connect you to the OECD hotspot, to Wisembly, and you can check out the screens or the postcards on your seats for how to connect. So go ahead, take a moment to do that. And as you see, we are in the Amphitheater 3. And so please connect to app.wisembly.com/OECD3. So during the debate, don't hesitate to ask questions, to make comments, and our great social media team will send me the questions and the comments. And I think this could enrich our debate on very importantly. So feel free and make your voice heard. I also would like to introduce our Wisembly poll. I would like to hear your opinion about the question. The following question: do you support a legal and mandatory right for affordable housing? Do you support a legal right for affordable housing? You can vote now, or you can vote also during the sessions, maybe after hearing some of the points and that the speakers will follow up. After like maybe 10 minutes before the end of the sessions, I will give you the results, and I would like the speakers to comment these results. So I think this could be a good final word to close our sessions. Okay, enough of that introductory speaking. I would like to introduce now our speakers. Jean-Baptiste Hérault, which is spokesperson of the French Association Droit au Logement. And on my left, Bjorn Hastrup, CEO from DaneH, a non-profit Danish organization. And your mission is, I like this, I find that on your website, to fight for a society, I would like to quote that, in which the person is more important than the person's age. I think a very good statement. Sophie Redelay is on my right. You're a senior project developer with the organization Revive in Belgium. Welcome here in Paris. And Elizabeth Rappaport, you're from the Urban Land Institute, an international organization. You are based in London. Welcome here. And a very warm welcome also to Steph Shafir. You are from Israel. You're the youngest female deputy in the Israeli history. I read, right, in the parliament. You are, I wanted to introduce as a former activist, but you corrected me and said, no, I'm still an activist. So you're deputy and activist, very good. And you also participated, and I think that's one of the reasons they invited you here, at the social movement, if you remember, in Israel in 2011, that made international headlines, where hundreds of thousands from mostly young people entered the streets and demonstrate for affordable housing, for a more inclusive social policy. So I would ask you the first question, Steph. How does it, you made the big jump from activist, from decision to this decision maker, but you still are an activist. Did you have the chance to push any of your former revendications forward while you are in Parliament? Take a microphone.
Thank you. Well, first of all, the short answer is yes. The longer answer, would be that 5 years ago, when we started the protest movement, the protest was a rise of a generation saying, the generation in Israel explaining to the Israeli public, we have a problem. There is a generational gap in everything that's related to housing. And what our parents' generation could afford, buying, after they got married, they could take a mortgage and buy a house in a relatively decent price. For our generation, this is impossible. Today in Israel, if you want to buy a house, you need an average of 144 salaries. If you want to buy a house in Jerusalem, this would be 196 salaries. So just imagine how much time it takes, salaries, without any expenditure on food or anything like that. How much time it takes to buy a house. So this makes it impossible. 2 million people, which is a quarter of our society, live in rent. There is no rent regulation, so prices go up and up. And at a certain moment, with a bunch of 10 other students, we decided that this time we're not just going to demonstrate, we're going to actually move and live on the street. And within about a week, this became one of Israel's biggest protest movement to change for affordable housing and more than that, for affordable life, bringing 10% of the Israeli population to the street. Now, what was special, I think, about the example that the protest gave Israel was that it wasn't just talking about affordable housing, it was building an example for affordable housing. If you looked at the different tent camps that people were building, they were building the future neighborhoods the way that they wanted to see them. There were people who came from a richer background together with people who literally lived on the street, homeless people, who came together to build these future neighborhoods. When I later decided that if we want to accomplish something, we have to get into the political system, and when I got into the Israeli parliament, the first bill that I started to legislate was a rent regulation bill. But the way I decided to do it was not directly through parliament, but again through the public. I went on Facebook and asked people in Israel to tell me about their rent problems. 24 hours, 500 comments, stories from all over the country. These are the kind of problems that we have. We then went to house owners and tried to create a more balanced regulation. The government was opposing that regulation completely in the beginning, so we went again to the streets and we got thousands of signatures of young people saying this is the kind of bill that we want to see passed. Today, it's after 3 years, the bill is finally being passed, next week actually, but it was really a result of the public defining what they want, creating the kind of political power that allows us to make it work, and the kind of political pressure that allows it to be passed, together with the professional information. We worked a lot with the OECD experts on housing to create the kind of regulation that would suit Israel. And I think if just to sum this up, people know what they want. If the government would try to solve the housing crisis only from the angle of the amount of houses that we need to build, it will never be solved. Because we can't just build houses. We can't continue to build public social housing that are distanced from the center of the neighborhood and are not mixed with other socioeconomic backgrounds, and with that preventing social mobility. We can't continue to do the same thing and expect that this time it will work. People want to live in heterogenic neighborhoods. They want to see their grandparents living together and sharing the same neighborhood with them. They want to see an affordable housing that's based on a mixture of socioeconomic backgrounds, so that we can create social mobility and create strong neighborhoods and strong communities. And when people were asked in the two most crowded cities in Israel, in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and the places where the housing prices are the highest, people were asked what they are lacking in their neighborhoods. More than they said that it was the prices of the cost of living, they said that they were lacking a community. So we need to build houses and neighborhoods that support the future communities, that create social mobility, that create a stronger society, that create a stronger connection between what the people want and the way that governments and municipalities operate.
Well, thank you very much. You already raised up a lot of questions, and we could do a debate with you, just you on the stage. I know, but you already. I think you get to know that all our speakers came from very, very different backgrounds. So everyone has his own story. And another story that I would like to hear is the story of Elizabeth. Not your personal story, but you told me just in our introductory session that you came here, you prepared our text, but but then what happened in London? The terrorist attack made you change some ideas. So I just would like to say, go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, I think in some ways I'm coming at the same issue that Stav was talking about, this issue of community, but perhaps from a different direction. So I live in London. I've lived there for 15 years. We've had a rough weekend. We've had a rough few months in the UK. And it's got me thinking about, I guess, about the effect of terrorism on what I do as an urbanist and an urban planner and urban policy and development person. I think anyone who lives in a more volatile location than I'm used to living in understands that terrorism has an effect on the way that we live in cities. It can affect anything from which side of the pavement you choose to walk on when you're walking down the street to where you choose to rent or buy a home. But I think it's important also in sessions like these that we start thinking about how it affects urban policy and planning and also affordable housing across probably all OECD countries. And when I was thinking about this, I thought back to something that an old boss of mine said when I was in my first job working in the New York City department responsible for developing affordable housing. The commissioner at the time said something, she used to say something that really stuck with me. She said, those of us who are in this position of setting policy and developing affordable housing, we have to think about where the guy who delivers your Chinese food lives. And, it was a really simple remark, but I think what she was trying to say is, we have to remember that housing policy, housing discussions can get so technical, so detailed, so nuanced, so wonky, really. But actually what you're talking about is fundamentally a basic human need, right? The basic human need for shelter. But there's another basic human need that's equally important, and that's that need that I think Stav was drawing on, which is this need for connection across people, across communities, across different age groups. And so I think when we talk about housing, we have to talk not just about the individual place that somebody lives, that dwelling unit, but also that bigger picture of the place and the community that you live in. So I think I would pose to this audience that we need to think about where the guy who's on the ISIS chat room lives, right? Where is he living? And not just, again, his housing unit, but his community. Who is he interacting with on a daily basis? And what are we doing as thinkers and as policymakers to shape that? Now, I mean, at ULI, we talk a lot about, our mission is to promote the responsible use of land, and we talk about different ways to do that. But I think fundamentally, we have to think about how we can create places and communities that foster positive connections, that foster building positive social capital. And we've talked in some of our previous research about the characteristics of what we call good density, and that's urban development that is dense, but is also, connected, it is diverse, it is inclusive. And I think there's potential benefits we have to think through, I think, the potential benefits of that in terms of this issue of community building. So some of the ones that I think about, are, I guess we have to think about in terms of how urban development can promote the mental and physical health of people, how it can promote how our communities are also interacting with things like the isolation and loneliness that a lot of people, and that actually leads them down these paths of, greater division and even radicalism. So I think it'd be good to talk about some examples, but I'm going to leave that to Sophie, because I think she has actually a really good example of that as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Elizabeth. I think, Sophie, you have a very good example just in the following up of what Elizabeth talked about, because your organization, Revive, you did a project, and this project is, I think, not even more in the state of project, but it's also being implemented. It's going to be implemented, right, in the neighborhood, in the district, in the Brussels district, Molenbeek. Nobody knew about Molenbeek 2 years ago, but then unfortunately it came under international headlines with the terrorist attack in Paris and also in Brussels. So tell us a little bit about this this project.
Right. So just to frame Revive a little bit, so we are a market company, we are a project developer, but we are a brownfield developer, so we only develop former industrial sites. A lot of our sites are polluted, or a lot of our sites are very difficult, and so that's where Molenbeek comes into the picture. We have been working on this project for, I think, at least 5 years, in the whole planning process, the whole talking to all kinds of institutions and regulators about this project, also to investors. So our work in Molenbeek dates from before the unfortunate happenings that made Molenbeek known for a larger public. And even before, it was very, very hard for us to find allies in this context. We didn't find allies. It was hard to find allies, let's say, from investors. It was hard to find finance.
What was the purpose of the project?
Well, actually, again, talking about Revive, our tagline is "We build society, not real estate." And so we have as a philosophy that it's not so hard to put stones one on the other. It's actually far more difficult to build societies and to build communities. I think it's a common the philosophy of many speakers here. And so the reason why we wanted to go to Molenbeek is that, and of course there's always risks of gentrification and other risks that have to be guarded or looked at. But basically why we wanted to invest in Molenbeek is that there's a need, and really an urgent need of investment there, but there's also a high need of inclusion, of mix. Molenbeek basically, and historically it has been created like that. It's a sort of endpoint, and when we talk about social mobility in Molenbeek, it's very low. And so there was a need of investment from different perspectives. We wanted to insert or create a project on a dilapidated site. It was a former brewery, hasn't been touched for 30 years. It was a cancer in the city, basically. It was also, that's another reason, it was a cancer in the urban tissue around it. It was a huge garbage belt, basically. So that's also a reason to restore activity on that site. We wanted to make a project of mixed functions, so we wanted to add housing, of course, but also childcare, also a school for children from 2.5 to 12 years old. We didn't want to include one type of housing, but also a mixture of housing. We now succeeded in planning social housing, affordable housing, and free market housing in one building. We have been talking to public authorities also about funding for the school. It was extremely difficult. Molenbeek needs really a lot of new schools. Education, we're not going on that debate, that's a debate on its own, but education, of course, is key in this whole debate as well. But even then, it was very hard to find funding for a school. We did find it now, so the school is going to be built. We are on the building site right now. You can see it already. I don't know how updated Google is, but it would be interesting to find out. I should have done it. But so yeah, the project is moving on, and just for a little anecdote, we used the visit of Trump to Belgium, to Brussels, basically, as an occasion to attract the attention of the press, to say Trump called Brussels, and especially Molenbeek, a hellhole, and we used his expressions to say, listen, this is not a hellhole, this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to create a community and to talk about inclusion.
Thank you very much for this, having talked about this initiative. I turn now myself to Jan. You are the CEO of Dane Age, with this membership Danish organization. You're also teaching at university. So you are specialized, because if we talk about affordable housing, we are talking about affordable housing for whom? could be for students, could be for low-income people, could be for immigrants, and you are focused on elderly people. And I read that your organization is quite popular in Denmark because you have like 80,000 membership, or 70?
800,000.
800,000, yes.
15% of the Danish population.
Wow. So there's a real need for affordable housing for elderly people in Denmark?
Yes, there are. And the needs are not exploding like we see in many other countries. I can explain it this way. Government and parliament had made a retirement reform, which means that in 2040, the retirement age is 70. And in 2060, it's 75. That means a newborn baby, she can retire when she's 75. That means that number of pensioners in Denmark do not grow anymore, even though the people are growing. So let me start in this end. There are money for making affordable housing for old people. Secondly, it's important to underline that the demography in the future time tells us there will be more and more single and more old age people as couple living apart. And does the total mass of buildings in Denmark shoot with that? No. The formal politics today is that you should move to a more suitable house in good times. Nobody does that. Old people, even 60, 80 plus people, want to stay at their home. They don't want to move. They don't want to get out to another city, another quarter. So you can't replace the population, but you can change the politics. And the politics is to try to support those people who want to stay put in their homes. And I think this is the best politics we have seen in our country. The way we do it is by financed by taxes and by support for people who can't afford their rent. That's what we call support for means-tested people. So you have to apply for that money, and then most people are able to live in the house they have been all the time. But I think this lead me to a future time when I believe that old age people would try to get young people into their homes or other old age people into their homes. So I see a future where we bring people together in big houses and big flats, which we don't see today, but that could be one of the solutions. Let me now underline that we also emphasize on the next generation. One of your questions was, what are we going to do with the next generation? They have really big difficulties to penetrate the housing market. And
I'm sorry, this is just interrupt you because this is one of the questions that came from the audience.
Good.
I just read the question. Italy, Spain, Greece, young people share the same unaffordability of housing. Where's the flaw, the lie that leads to such a situation? That's exactly what you're asking me.
Okay, so that's what I'm going to answer.
And develop, yes.
What I have seen is that we have developed labor market pension funds, and those pension funds goes for everybody. They have to put their money into that funds, and the funds are growing and growing and growing. So they can sit there 50 years, 55 years, looking at their growing pension funds, but they need money for their housing. So my propositions are that we make a new law where people have access to that money to put into their own house, so they can own their house, which would be much more cheaper as being a tenant. And that means that pension funds shall realize it's not their money, it's even not the government's money, it's people's money. So I think we should give the opportunity for Danish people, even young people, at due time to take money out of the pension fund, run away and invest it into their own house, their own flat, their own home. I think this could open up for access for young people to own their own houses. And that could be a totally new situation for young people who are locked in with low income and high rents and extremely expensive new houses. Okay.
Very, very interesting point. Thank you, Björn. I would like to introduce our last speaker, Jean-Baptiste Hérault, a spokesman from Droit au Logement. Jean-Baptiste, je me permets de poser.
Jean-Baptiste, I will be asking the question in French.
I just maybe wait 2 or 3 seconds just to allow everyone to get a headphone. Okay. Jean-Baptiste.
So, Jean-Baptiste, I have a very brief question for you. What is the main challenge regarding social housing, the main challenge that you've seen in your daily work, which is being an activist for housing? Well, first of all, I'd like to say a few words on our organization called Droit au Logement, Right to Housing. I chair this organization. It has been in existence for 27 years, and we support tenants, people who live in precarious housing. In France, about 40% of the population rents their housing, half of which are in social housing. So we support tens of thousands of families who are either out on the street or who live in inadequate housing. Thanks to our activism, we also changed the law in France. There is now a law in France which requires that cities invest to build 20% of social housing on their land. We also have the mandatory right to housing. If a person has inadequate housing, they can go to a judge to ask for their right to housing to be enforced. So we continuously lobby the government, developers, social housing agencies in order to improve the lives of those without housing. And we believe that the right to housing is a fundamental right. Having no access to adequate housing means being left behind. It means being excluded from society. And what we're seeing today is a housing crisis. And in spite of the legal progress that has been made, this this housing crisis persists because of the price of housing. Rents have gone up for the past 15 years. Speculation is rife in most large cities, and policies have encouraged this speculation and price hikes. What we want to see is a regulation of rents or lower rents. We want to see a more regulated housing market. What we're seeing also is that the government and cities and local authorities are privatizing land. They are selling off land to private developers who are making money off collective land. And so what we're seeing now is that there is a decreasing capacity to build new housing for our children, for our grandchildren. And that's why government and public authorities need to preserve the right they have to manage public land. Now that's for the situation today. There are legal rights which unfortunately can't be enforced because social housing is still insufficient and private housing, the private market, is unaffordable. And what you need to keep in mind is that these are people we're talking about, young people who don't have access to housing. It's true in our country, it's true in many countries. The elderly who have low pensions, they can't stay in their apartments. The middle class, they also have difficulty because rents are too high. And all of this leads to an increase in inequalities. But not everyone is affected. The wealthy, the well-off, they are not affected. But the middle class, they no longer own their house, and sometimes they end up on the streets. And so when young people want to find housing, they just can't afford it. They can't own and they can't even rent. So we are also against the system of private holiday renting that Airbnb promotes, Airbnb, which is a supporter and one of the sponsors of today's events. But because of Airbnb, rents increase, and there are fewer and fewer private housing that are available for long-term tenants. So there are newcomers that are arriving that are encouraging speculation and getting rich off other people's lives. Now, there's also the issue of community. Three speakers have mentioned this idea of a community. Now, the human community, human beings, what we need are neighborhoods that are friendly, where people know each other, where they can speak and where they can talk. But will urban planning solve the issue of terrorism? Honestly, I don't think so. And urban planners have come up in the past with utopian ideals, how to build the perfect city, but unfortunately, this never met expectations. So I don't think that urban planning on its own can solve the issue of terrorism. But what we need to keep in mind is when you go to neighborhoods, to keep in mind that people are living there, and remember that these are the lives of individuals, and often public policies that we've seen in France, they create fragmentation. They scatter people everywhere into new neighborhoods they're unfamiliar with, where they don't know anyone. And that's not a difficulty when you're wealthy. You don't need to, you don't rely on your neighbors. You have help that you pay. But when you're poor, you need to have this social fabric. You need to be able to rely on your neighbors. Thank you very much. No, you didn't exceed your speaking time, but it's true that time is moving fast, and I'd like to thank all of our speakers. You were very passionate, and it's always fascinating to listen to passionate speakers. But I would also like to have one or two questions from the audience. We've heard from our panelists who represented different ideas.
Comments and also questions that the panelists raised without maybe having a direct answer. So if you have a question, I would like to take one or two questions from the audience. Yes. Can we have a microphone maybe for the young lady? Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I just would like to make a question for you. Forgive me that I don't remember your name. But yeah,
Sophie.
you were talking about how to say to revive neighborhood. So that is the name of your company that you work. But my question is, sometimes when you revive neighborhood, there is a risk that these neighborhoods that used to be popular neighborhoods become chic neighborhoods. And because they are now chic neighborhoods, they become more expensive. So the people that used to live there is forced to move away from they are used to live. So how do you deal with that?
That's the gentrification that was mentioned, and that's also what Jean-Baptiste mentioned. Indeed, you're right. And therefore, for example, in this particular project in Molenbeek, we introduced more than, I think, more than 60% of the residential units is either social housing or affordable housing controlled by state regulations. So that's one of the indeed, also what we did with this particular project is we we had a long process of planning, finding investors. We did find, by the way, the investors by the means of impact capital, which is a capital that might be interesting, which is a capital that has a triple bottom line. The only bottom line is not to gain financial profit, which we all know very well, but it's also an investment that only wants to invest if there is a social and ecological return from that. And so the social return is also found in this social or affordable housing. So that's another way to fight this gentrification that you mentioned. And so we also introduced the school in the project, kindergarten, etc. Another reason, another way of introducing the project in the Molenbeek neighborhood is to find allies in the neighborhood. Allies sounds a bit combative. That's not what I mean, but yeah.
Like partners.
Partners, thank you. Sorry. Partners in the neighborhood. We spoke to a lot of local community initiatives, associations, etc. We also invited them in the project. They have spaces in the project, etc. So we were not, I know what you mean by a project developer that comes and impose a massive real estate project in a neighborhood, but that's especially what we tried not to do here, nowhere, by the way, but especially also not here.
Well, thank you very much. Before maybe taking another question, I would like to ask our social media team to show up the result of our poll. You remember we asked at the beginning, we asked you to answer our introductory question: do you support a legal and mandatory right to affordable housing? So can we maybe show the result? Yes. And no. Very good. Very good audience. Well, yes. You were very convincing, Jean-Baptiste. Is there another question? There are a lot of questions. Yes.
All right. So first of all, I want to say thank you for the panels, for the ideas, and for the consistent works over the past couple of years. One question for me on questions to the panels. The major principles that we talk about today is rather than building brick by brick developed real estate, we need to build a more inclusive society, a more inclusive community, right? In the next 5 to 10 years, if we have to sit here again and if we have to discuss and advise and give advice to policymakers around the world, what would be your advices? Thank you.
Excellent question. Maybe Elizabeth, you already worked as a counselor and researcher.
I would say don't be afraid to take risks and try new things. I think there's a lot to be gained in policy making from experiments, from trying new things. In planning and housing is notoriously slow and bureaucratic, and it can take hundreds of individual steps to get one project approved, or years just to get anything off the ground, even in environments that aren't very complex. And it's important to get the balance between not bypassing steps that are in that process to make sure that things like affordable housing in a new development are protected, but at the same time you have to be able to be quick to respond to changes. And we have such a huge lack of affordable housing. One of the recent pieces of research that we did at ULI was about the impact of the recent wave of migration on real estate in European cities. And what we identified is a lot of cities are having to think quickly on their feet and think about how they can very quickly provide housing for quite a lot of new people in cities that already had chronic shortages of affordable housing, right? So how do you do that? And you see some exciting examples like Stadtblok Rieverhaven, which I'm pronouncing terribly, I apologize, in Amsterdam, which some of you may have heard of, which is a development of, I think, about 500 units where they have young Dutch people living alongside young refugees, and the whole development was produced in a way that the people who live there have to take an active part in managing it, and this builds community links from the bottom up. And these types of projects, which actually bring together people who might not interact or might, you know, not have anything in common, think they have anything in common, are really important. And I think those types of experiments are really important. And they're things, sometimes in difficult times, we try things we might not always try. And I think we're going to have to see a lot more of that in the coming years.
Yes, Björn?
I don't think that we can get the government to break into the free housing market. I think that would be very, very difficult to do in many countries. But I think what we can do is to break into the income generations and underline that we do not accept the results of how the market generates income. That's exactly how we do in the Scandinavian countries. And that means that we can make reimbursement for young people as rent so that they can penetrate the market, and for old people so they can stay put in their homes, and for young people who has their first job, let them be able to take their money out of the pension fund for investing in real estate. That will be my dream of 2025.
Thank you very much, Stav.
I think the most important thing is to not look at the housing crisis as just a crisis. The housing crisis is also an opportunity, and we have to see it this way today in order to solve it in the best way, because many of the policies that we see around the world and the policies that I see in my home country come from this chaos of the housing crisis and are very unstrategic. Now, we can see it as an opportunity in order to implement new policies much more flexible that today people are prepared for. For example, one of the most amazing examples that I saw for enriching neighborhoods in poor neighborhoods was participatory budget. Taking the poorest neighborhoods in a city and give them actual budget in their hands, but their way of using that budget to do whatever they choose to do. They can use it to build new houses, they can use it to build a music center, whatever they want. But then you give them the power, but they can use their power only if they create a democratic process, if they work together with the municipality in order to find a solution that they all agree on. And in every place that this participatory budget was tried, in Israel we tried it, in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv, it gave incredible results. People thought about the most creative things that they can put into their neighborhoods, and it was their own action, so they felt like they were sharing, they were taking part of it. It lowered crime levels tremendously. It created higher level of trust with the municipality and with the government, and it created a much more shared public environment within the neighborhoods. And if we're talking, we all talked in various ways about building communities. This is building community. So we have an opportunity here. We have an opportunity to stop thinking about houses as just a box that people are supposed to live in, and thinking about cities as places that people come to sleep in, but they don't actually live in and build their lives through, and start to build much more heterogenic cities that are based on community, that are made to create more social mobility, and there we can tackle other challenges that we have, poverty levels, socioeconomic gaps, through building and through solving the housing crisis.
Thank you very much, Steph. I think this is a very, very interesting point that you raised up. And you see, we start discussing about social housing, affordable housing. Now we're discussing about participatory democracy. So it comes all about democracy on the very ground level, on the communities, which means participate, which means that everyone has its own right to participate and can participate and have also the means and the structure that maybe politicians could get them. Last questions, and you have the challenge to close the session in maybe not 5 minutes, but 4 minutes. I know it's a very big challenge for you. Do you think that this kind of basic grassroots movement where people can organize themselves, what stuff we're talking about, could this be an example also for France? And do you see any example, maybe cities or communities where this kind of example is also does already exist?
Well, not really in neighborhoods. The question of participatory democracy is often biased because it's regulated. The decision makers, urban planners, have already decided on their programs. So the idea is simply to, it's a sort of phony consultations. People are asked to be convinced to accept the project that has already been decided. In France and elsewhere, because we communicate with other movements in Europe, in about 20 European countries, it's a sort of young coalition for the right to housing and the right to urban communities. So there are cooperatives that are emerging based on individual initiatives. They work with architects and technicians to build a building and to organize life and that building. So this is an interesting example. But we need very powerful financial tools and a strong political will to regulate the market and avoid economic crises that are caused by speculation, as you've seen in Spain, in the US, and in the UK, of course, as you know, and in France. There may be other crises in France also. So this is tragic. This speculation is the cause of economic crisis and political crisis. The question of housing is, of course, a source of frustration and populism, far-right populist movements that are a threat to democracy. And it's in the interest of everyone to have an inclusive society, enabling everyone to have affordable and adequate housing. I'm happy that the overwhelming majority of the Assembly was in favor of this kind of mandatory right to housing, not necessarily free housing, but a participation that would not be above 20, 25, or maximum 30% of people's income. Some people pay 60 and even 70% of their small wages in order to buy housing or to rent housing, and very poor quality housing in order to avoid having to live in the streets, because that is the worst that can happen to anyone. So we need now inclusive societies and the right for enforceable housing is one tool to make pressure on decision makers, financial and political decision makers, to invest into affordable and adequate housing. Well, thank you, Jean-Baptiste. And I believe that this message was well heard by 94% of our audience.
For participation, and I would like to thank all the speakers, Jean-Baptiste, the staff, Bian, Sophie and Elizabeth. Thank you also to our social media team. Thank you very much, and have a good lunch. Thank you.